In the final days of World War II, the scale of global military mobilization was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers, drawn from every corner of the world, were stationed in vast barracks, makeshift camps, and permanent military installations that had sprung up across the European and Pacific theaters. The collapse of Nazi Germany, the Japanese surrender, and the subsequent end of hostilities left behind a landscape heavily marked by the presence of these military facilities. What had once been essential to the war effort now seemed surplus, yet their scale and cost could not be easily dismissed. With the cessation of hostilities, what was to become of the infrastructure that had housed and supported millions of soldiers during the war? The sheer number of facilities in question is staggering. In 1945, the Allied forces alone had constructed over 12,000 military bases, many of which were purpose-built to house and support the enormous personnel requirements of wartime. These installations ranged from temporary camps thrown together in haste to sprawling complexes that housed tens of thousands of soldiers for extended periods. In addition to the vast barracks, there were maintenance shops, administrative buildings, kitchens, and medical facilities. Each base was a self-contained microcosm, designed for maximum efficiency in a wartime context. Yet, as the war ended, so too did the immediate need for these facilities. The end of active fighting meant a dramatic reduction in personnel, which was further compounded by the return of soldiers to their home countries. Across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, millions of troops were suddenly left without purpose, while the infrastructure that had supported them began to be seen as increasingly unnecessary. What had once been vital to the war effort was now viewed as a drain on limited resources. The immediate post-war period was marked by a prevailing sense of uncertainty. For the Allied powers, the vast network of barracks and military bases posed both an administrative and logistical challenge. There was no clear plan for what would happen to the thousands of structures scattered across the globe. In the United States, the Department of Defense was tasked with the daunting responsibility of overseeing the demobilization of millions of soldiers and determining what to do with the surplus infrastructure left behind. The decision-making process was hindered by an acute lack of coordination among the various military branches and Allied governments. Economically, the pressures were immediate and severe. The war had left the Allied powers financially strained, with enormous national debts and a pressing need to transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. The prospect of maintaining vast military facilities, many of which were in remote or economically underdeveloped regions, became increasingly untenable. The cost of keeping these bases operational, even at a reduced capacity, was seen as an unnecessary burden in the face of other urgent priorities, such as rebuilding war-torn economies and addressing widespread civilian shortages. In Europe, particularly in Germany, Italy, and France, the situation was equally complex. The victorious Allied forces found themselves occupying vast swathes of territory that had once been the heart of the Axis war machine. The Allied military presence in these regions meant the continued use of numerous barracks and bases, but this was also accompanied by the need for significant reconstruction efforts in the wake of the war's devastation. German and Italian military facilities, many of which had been designed to support the war effort, were now viewed as redundant, particularly as the former Axis powers faced demilitarization and occupation. The challenge was twofold: maintaining the necessary military presence in these areas while also dismantling or repurposing the war infrastructure that had once been vital. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, faced a different set of challenges. With its heavy emphasis on centralized military power, the USSR had built a massive network of barracks and bases to house its rapidly expanding Red Army. After the war, much of this infrastructure remained intact, but the Soviet leadership was keenly aware of the need to transition to a peacetime footing. The Soviets began the slow and methodical process of reducing their military footprint in Eastern Europe, though this would take several years to fully accomplish. In the meantime, Soviet barracks, storage facilities, and other military complexes continued to serve their purpose as the Red Army was gradually downsized. In the Pacific, the situation was no less challenging. The vast network of military facilities in the region, built to support the American war effort against Japan, had been spread across a wide range of islands and territories. With the war's end, these bases were suddenly seen as extraneous to post-war requirements. In some cases, American military leaders opted to simply abandon the bases, leaving them to be reclaimed by nature. In other instances, the U.S. government sought to repurpose or sell off the installations to allied governments or private interests, though this process was complicated by the sheer remoteness of many of these locations. The initial response to the surplus military infrastructure was often ad hoc and chaotic. In some cases, barracks were simply abandoned, left to decay in the elements. The costs of dismantling or repurposing the facilities were often prohibitively high, particularly in remote locations where the necessary equipment and manpower were scarce. Local populations, often facing severe food and housing shortages in the wake of the war, were sometimes enlisted to dismantle or repurpose the materials in exchange for meager compensation. In other instances, governments sought to repurpose the facilities for civilian use. Some of the larger, more durable structures were converted into temporary housing for displaced persons or refugees, though this was often seen as a stopgap measure. The United States, for example, converted many of its barracks in Germany into temporary homes for displaced Europeans, while the United Kingdom repurposed some of its wartime installations to house returning soldiers and their families. However, these efforts were largely insufficient to deal with the scale of the problem. The economic pressures of the immediate post-war period meant that the government could not afford to maintain or repurpose every facility, particularly as the number of returning soldiers exceeded the demand for housing. By 1946, the sheer scale of the problem was becoming more apparent. Across Europe and the Pacific, millions of square feet of military facilities stood empty, waiting to be either dismantled or repurposed. Some bases were simply too large or too strategically located to be abandoned outright, but the question remained: what could be done with the excess infrastructure that had once been integral to the war effort? Would the remnants of the wartime mobilization be repurposed in the years to come, or would they be left to rot, abandoned to the passage of time? In the face of this uncertainty, governments began to explore a variety of options. Some nations, particularly those in Europe, began to sell off surplus military equipment and infrastructure to other countries, with the hope that this would provide some much-needed economic relief. Others, particularly in the United States, began to consider converting some military installations into industrial or civilian centers. The drive to reduce military expenditures while still maintaining a level of military readiness led to a variety of repurposing schemes, many of which would take decades to fully realize. As the war faded into history, the fate of the vast barracks that had once housed millions of soldiers remained an unresolved question. Would they be dismantled or repurposed? Would they be abandoned and forgotten? The post-war world, shaped by both optimism and uncertainty, found itself facing a problem that was as vast as it was unsolvable, a legacy of war whose full consequences had yet to unfold. As the years after World War II unfolded, the vast network of military bases and barracks that had once served the Allied and Axis powers continued to shape the post-war landscape, but not in ways that anyone could have foreseen at the time. The magnitude of what had been constructed during the war, and the sheer number of soldiers housed in these installations, posed a problem that would take decades to address. What had once been essential to the war effort, massive infrastructure designed to support military mobilization on an unprecedented scale, now stood as a monument to a world that no longer needed it. By the end of the 1940s, the immediate post-war crisis had largely subsided. However, the question of what to do with the surplus military bases remained a complex one, entangled in economic, political, and logistical considerations. The early post-war years had been a time of rapid change, with nations focused on rebuilding their war-torn economies and societies. While governments initially acted swiftly to repurpose or dismantle some of these facilities, the long-term impact of this decision would only become apparent much later. Many of the structures that had been hastily constructed during the war were now far too expensive to maintain or abandon without further cost. As such, the solutions were often piecemeal and varied by location. The United States, having emerged from the war as a global superpower, faced its own unique set of challenges. As early as 1947, the U.S. government began to reorient its military strategy and presence across the globe. The overwhelming surplus of wartime infrastructure, many of which were military barracks, airfields, and logistics centers, presented a problem of its own. Though some of these bases would remain active during the early years of the Cold War, the economic realities of the post-war period meant that the U.S. government had to make tough decisions regarding which installations would stay open, which would be repurposed, and which would be decommissioned entirely. The process of downsizing began with a systematic evaluation of military needs in different regions. American forces had constructed dozens of large military bases across Europe during the war, particularly in countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Some of these bases, such as those in Germany, had been integral to the American occupation of post-war Europe. However, with the rise of the Soviet threat in the late 1940s, the U.S. military found itself facing a new set of priorities. The establishment of NATO in 1949 and the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union necessitated a continued military presence in Europe, albeit one that would require far fewer personnel and far less infrastructure. The post-war surplus of barracks, particularly in Germany, required the U.S. military to reassess what could be done with its existing facilities. Many barracks were dismantled or converted into storage depots for military equipment, while others were left to decay as the U.S. military consolidated its efforts into fewer, more strategic bases. Some were sold to local governments or private enterprises, though the scale of repurposing was limited, as many of these structures were simply too large and outdated to be viable for civilian use. The United Kingdom faced similar challenges in dealing with its own surplus military infrastructure. During the war, Britain had built an extensive network of military facilities, ranging from barracks to airfields and depots, often in remote or strategically important locations. By the time the war ended, the need for many of these bases had drastically decreased. The British government initially struggled to find viable uses for these structures, particularly as its economy was in shambles and resources were scarce. In the years immediately following the war, some British military bases were converted into civilian housing or industrial centers, particularly in areas like Wales and Northern Ireland. However, as in the United States, the sheer scale of the infrastructure meant that many bases would remain abandoned for years. Some of the more remote military outposts were sold off to private landowners or left to decay, while others were repurposed for other government functions, such as training centers for the military or intelligence agencies. Perhaps the most significant change in the fate of these military facilities came with the rise of the Cold War. The looming threat of Soviet expansion forced many Western nations to reconsider their military strategies and, by extension, the infrastructure that supported them. In Europe, military bases were repurposed to house more permanent Cold War installations, including nuclear missile silos, early warning radar systems, and communications hubs. The military barracks, once designed for millions of soldiers engaged in combat, were now transformed into facilities housing specialized personnel for the new arms race. The post-war surplus was reconfigured into something that was still essential, but not in the same way it had been during the war. While military forces in Europe were being restructured, the situation in the Pacific was more varied. The United States, having defeated Japan, had initially maintained a large military presence throughout the Pacific, including the Philippines, Japan itself, and a host of smaller island nations. In the years immediately following the war, much of the infrastructure built to support the war effort was abandoned. On some of the more remote islands, military bases were simply closed and left to deteriorate, while others were repurposed for civilian use. The former American territories of the Philippines and Guam saw some of their military facilities converted into civilian airports, ports, and warehouses as these regions began to move away from their wartime status. The case of Japan is particularly poignant. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Japan was occupied by the Allied forces, with the U.S. military assuming control over many of the country's military bases and installations. Over the next several decades, much of this infrastructure was either dismantled or repurposed, although some bases remained active. The U.S. military continued to occupy certain facilities, notably in Okinawa, which would remain strategically important throughout the Cold War. Yet, the physical legacy of the war was evident across the country, with abandoned barracks, airfields, and fortifications standing as reminders of the nation's wartime past. In the Soviet Union, the story was similarly one of gradual change, albeit with a more centralized and controlled approach. The USSR, having established a formidable network of military bases and facilities across its vast territory and in Eastern Europe, faced a situation where it was forced to retain much of its wartime infrastructure. The post-war period for the Soviet Union was marked by a delicate balance of maintaining a strong military presence while managing the enormous cost of such an extensive military apparatus. Over time, many of the wartime bases were either modernized or repurposed to house the growing Soviet military-industrial complex. Others were closed down, but this process was often slow and methodical, as Soviet leaders were cautious about leaving gaps in military readiness. By the 1960s, many of the larger, obsolete military bases from the World War II era had either been dismantled, converted, or left to rot. In Western Europe, remnants of the war's infrastructure could still be found, sometimes buried under new civilian developments or integrated into Cold War-era military installations. In the United States, the process of decommissioning large wartime bases continued well into the 1950s and 1960s, although some facilities would remain in use for decades. The historical loss of so much military infrastructure became part of the post-war world's quiet transformation, a shift away from the total war mentality to one that focused on containment and deterrence.